Let's build a retirement plan. I'm going to start down here in about B7 and type the word periods and see how many periods we have room for on my screen here. Looks like I can get to about 20. So let's think about 20 years. Let's say a client comes to us and needs some help with financial planning and brings a beginning portfolio of $100,000. And we want to allocate some of that to equities. Say 70% to equities. That means our beginning balance in equities is going to be whatever our beginning portfolio is times the percentage allocated to equities. And let's say we can expect some type of return based on the equities we choose to invest in. And let's assume that's 7%. And that there's some uncertainty around there, so there's a standard deviation of returns. And let's say that's 3%. What does that mean? That means that from our 67% rule, that about 2/3 of the time we could expect any one of these periodic returns to be between 4 and 10, or plus or minus one standard deviation. And the way we'd calculate that, we'd use our good friend norm.inv, if I could spell it, and choose some random number, give it the mean and the standard deviation, and watch what happens. Each time I recalculate, let me do an Alt-HP, each time I recalculate by hitting F9, it chooses a different return for us. So we have the capability now each year to have a different return. And we think that based on the mean and the standard deviation we chose, that that return should be, as I say, about 2/3 of the time should be between 4 and 10. About 95% of the time should be between 1 and 13. And that would give us an ending balance in equities. Or let me actually say, let's calculate our returns first. And so if we started with 70,000 in equities and we got a 7% return on it, then we would make that much. Let me do an Alt-HO, Alt-H9, Alt-H9, Alt-H9. Get rid of those cents. So that's our returns, and we could end up with an ending balance of whatever our beginning balance in equities was plus the returns. Now you say, why didn't you just do that all in one column? We could have consolidated a lot of these columns, but this will give us some clarity and hopefully make the video easier to follow. And also, if we choose later to tax these returns different than the cash returns we're about to calculate, we have them available. So now let's talk about cash returns. I'm going to copy all of these headers. And if I'd been wise, I would have used some dollar signs in there to do that. But since I didn't, we'll go through this again. So 1 minus however much we allocated to equities is our allocation to cash. Our beginning balance is our beginning portfolio balance times that equity to allocation to cash. And in my model, I'm assuming that expected and standard deviation of returns don't have any meaning. So I'm just going to hard code a 1% return on cash. And so now my return on cash would be the beginning balance times that 1% return. And my ending balance in cash would be the beginning balance plus the return. Let's do a little bit of formatting here. First, let's select all these cells. And I'll do Control-1 to pull up this format cells. And instead of merging those cells, which is a horrible idea, let's go to horizontal and center across selection. It basically gives us the same effect as merging. And now I want to select the columns that apply to equities and do an Alt-HBT for thick borders. Select these, do a Control-Y to repeat that. I'm going to select all of these and do an Alt-HBA for all borders. Come over here, do an Alt-HBT for thick borders. You don't have to do these borders, but just wanted to let you know how I was doing those. So we've got our headers, we've got our first year calculation. Now what else could happen to our portfolio? We could earn some money, so I'm going to call this activity. Center that across selection. And how could we change it? We could earn some things or we could spend some things. And so let's say we earn, I think the average for finance grads is $55,000 a year, and hopefully we're spending less than we make. So let's say we're spending a little bit less. So So here again, I'll do a Alt HBT, Alt HBA, Alt HBT, and then we should have an ending portfolio. Alt HAC, Alt HBT. And so what's our ending portfolio? Well, it's the sum of our ending balance in equities, our ending balance in cash, however much we added from earnings, and however much we subtracted from spending. So it's the sum of those four things. You won't be able to replicate that number because remember this is based on a random return right here from this norm.inverse function. However, we can come over here and say that the beginning portfolio this year is simply equal to the ending portfolio of last year. And all of these others should just copy down. And then all of these should copy down. I'm going to copy and paste. It's only 20 rows. So we get an idea. We want to be around $500,000. Let me undo that and show you a pitfall that you may run into. It's tempting to come in here and double click this. And a couple of things really messed up. One was the 70%, where I assumed that Excel would just give me a 70% all the way down. It chose to increment that. Over here on the 1, it chose to increment that too. So this is not at all what we want. We don't want our allocation to get all wacky like that. Or our cash returns, we just want them to copy straight down. So that's why I copied it the way I did. If you really wanted to double click, if you had hundreds of rows, you could copy this one time. And now if I select both of those before double clicking, Excel won't get confused. It will say, oh, he had 70 and 70, so I'll just stick with 70. He had 1 and 1, so I'll just stick with 1. So Excel needs a couple of rows if you're going to use that autofill with your mouse. Since our ending portfolio balance at the end of the plan is pretty important, let's call that an output. We could argue that that's the whole purpose of doing this, is to find out how much money we have at the end of the plan. So every time I hit F9, that number should change because it will be selecting different returns in this column. Because remember, every one of these selects a random return. So if I come down here and hit F9, 400,000, 430, 548, that was a nice outcome, 509. So we can see that we could build a distribution here. Before I do that, just a couple of notes. We could get a little bit more creative with our earnings. Hopefully we'd be getting some kind of raises in there. We may even decide to retire and set these to 0 at some point. If you do a retirement planning project, those are some places you could be creative. Also, our spending, we could come up with different logic for our spending. As our earnings go up, perhaps our spending goes up. We could say if we have a bad year in the stock market, then maybe our spending goes down. Or if we have a good year in the stock market, maybe our spending goes up a little. If we wanted to save for college, maybe we could actually insert some additional rows and columns in here. And we have like college for young children, or maybe we want a boat or a lake house or something. And so maybe we come in here and put some spending in there. And of course we'd need to adjust these formulas as well. And what we find out pretty quickly is we can't spend $400,000 in the middle of our plan and end up anywhere but in the red. Let me go ahead and widen that column. So let's consider, instead of an Ivy League school, maybe a state school. And that looks like that's a bit more doable. And I leave it to you to get creative with what types of spending or how you'd like to project earnings in your project. I would like to offer a couple of suggestions. And before I do, I'm going to clean up my borders here a little bit. Also point out that you might want to put in the age of your client. Hate to do this to you, but I'm going to insert some rows. It's going to change some of the formulas, but hopefully not significantly. So let's build a tiny little dashboard up here. So if your client has a current age, Alt HAR, of, I think I said 40 earlier, because they went school late if they're getting out of school making 55, but they're 40 years old, but that's okay. So their current age would drive this number. And all the others, and this may come in helpful for you when you're building your dashboard if you want to talk about when they're going to retire. You could even put in a column for a year or something like that. Other things you might care about are the type of college. So let's think about dashboard here. And I just want to show you two quick ways that we could tie the dashboard to our spending down here. One, remember that when we link a checkbox using the cell link over here, we always like to color that yellow so we remember it's linked. Then checking that box will be true, we're going to college. So let's say save for college, Alt HAR. And then we also may want to have an amount. So format control, cell link over here. I made that one 3D, so I'm going to make these two 3D as well, but they should already be linked. Doesn't show it when I select two at a time, but if I select only one, format control, it should be linked. Always need to have this box a little bit bigger than the buttons inside of it. So we're linking that to R5. So let's color R5 yellow. And let's give it amounts. Let's say that an Ivy League would be, what did I use before? 100,000. That's a little bit high, but let's say 60,000 a year. Let's say a state school might be 40,000 a year, and a community college might be 15,000 per year. So down here I can say index, pick one of those based on this number. Down here, make that negative. And for each of these I want to say look at the cell above. And so now when I change which school we go to, it changes it down here. But I'd like to also do one more thing. I'd like to multiply that by true or false. Remember we did that in a previous video. And so now I can turn college on or off by clicking the checkbox without having to worry about which school I'm changing. Could easily have put a fourth option that was none and 0, but this is just another option. Remember, you'll be graded on creativity on your dashboard, and that gives you some options there. So you could tie some other kind of control to the boat and so on. Now let's talk about the chances of meeting our goal. I think when I copied these down, I lost the formatting here, but it was formatted as an output. So let's do data table on a blank cell to run this model 1,000 times and see how this output changes. So remember, data table on a blank cell starts with iterations. And in this case, I'm just going to have the output, call it end portfolio. We don't have any clear random inputs that we could use. So I'll leave a blank cell and do 1, 2, and then count that down to 1,000. Tell it what output I'm looking for. Format that as an output. These as inputs. And now I'm ready to run the Monte Carlo simulation by doing data table on a blank cell and just saying that these column inputs go here, which I forgot to color yellow, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to snag that format, do a paste special formats, and we can see that we get 1,000 different possible outcomes for our ending portfolio value. That means we could do a running average. Make our convergence chart. And see that, yeah, less than 500, this thing's still moving around a lot. After about 500, it starts to converge toward about a little over 58,000 ending balance. Now I still haven't done the histogram, but since I've started on the convergence chart, I'll go ahead and do the percent rank chart. And maybe abbreviate that a little bit. Remember, percent rank is where we use the percent rank inclusive function. We look at the array of outputs, and the, oops, that's going to need a absolute reference, and then the particular output we're looking at. So let me give that a absolute references. And what we see is that 61,000 ending portfolio was right about in the middle. So double click that down. And 98 is about as high as it gets. And 27 is about as low as it gets. We'll confirm that on the histogram here in a moment. But for now, I'm going to control click, control shift down. Use the mouse to get back up to the top. I'm doing Alt ND to get this scatter chart. If you try a line chart and it doesn't work, don't call me, just come back and use an XY scatter chart. Also, if you plot it against iterations and it doesn't work, don't call me, plot it against the ending portfolio value. And then you get a much smoother curve. Now we can add our lines to this for value at risk and goal. I think I'll go ahead and do the frequency chart first, the histogram. And remember, it has bins and frequency. And since we know these ranged from about 27,000 to about 100,000, I think I'll just go from 0 to 10 and count that way up to about 120. Use the frequency function and say, look at this data array and bin it into these bins. And we see the type of bell curve there that we like to see. So here I'm going to say apostrophe greater than 120. And since this is a bar chart, we're going to make it using Alt N, I think it's C1 for that bar chart, like the first one there, and we get our histogram. And it confirms what we saw before, that the possible outcome for this client upon retirement is somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000, with a most likely up around 60,000. Now let's put some more specific numbers on that, going to our cumulative probability chart, which I should always scale from 0 to 1. And remember, there are 3 points for the goal line. So if I have a goal, let's say the client wants $80,000 upon retirement. That would be our x-axis. I'm going to have 3 points. I'm going to have 80 on the x-axis and 0. That'll give me a point about right here. And then I'm going to have 80, which is where I input it. I guess you could have input it up here, but this will carry through to the next one as well. 80, and then here we want to use the percent rank just like we did before. This will tell us what is the confidence that we have that will have something equal to or less than 80. And so if I take this array, go from the top to the bottom, and then compare that to the 80, says about a 90%. And we have in this case, a 92% probability of being less than 80,000. That's not really our chance of success. It would be 1 minus that, but that's where we need to be on the chart. So we'll go with the 92. And since that's a number that we calculated, let's format it as an output. So we know that this is the one we can change, and this is the one that will get the result. And then to get the third and final point, after this line starts here, goes up, and comes over, we're going to want 0 on the x-axis and our calculated number on the y. So I'll type in a 0 and say equals this. Now let's see if that worked. Let's say, and let me change these to percentages while I'm at it, using an Alt-HP. So copy, select, however you get to paste special. I do an Alt-HVS. We want to paste in a new series in columns. We don't have names in the first row, but we do have x values in the first column. And so I see a point and a point and a point. So I got the data the way I'm looking for it, but I don't really want to show markers. Instead, I'd like to show a line. And that color line is good enough for me. So that's my goal. And I'm going to have something very similar. That's going to be a value at risk. A little bit of a misnomer when we're talking about retirement planning, but that's what we think of, where this is our input and this is our output. And here we're going to enter. We want about a 0.05. So this time we're going to use, instead of the percent rank, we'll use the percentile function and say, look in this and find the 5th percentile, if you will. And I throw these 5 and 95 around a little bit loosely. Depends on whether you're a P90 big or a P90 small convention. We'll copy this, Alt-HVS, categories in the first column, and now we see our downside for 95%. So format that again to show no marker, but to show lines. And in this case, I'll color it red, since we're saying that's kind of our downside scenario. Now, if you wanted to get a little carried away with your model and with your dashboard and make it super helpful, you could tie a spinner to this. So I could say, well, what if the goal instead of 80 were only 70,000? And it moves the blue line, you'll notice. And then same thing here. If instead of a 5% worst case scenario, we wanted to see a 10% worst case scenario, it moves the red line. Unfortunately, every time it recalculates, it also moves this line. This is probably a good time to talk about calculation. If I go over to File, Options, Formulas, and say only recalculate what's not in a data table. So my workbook will recalculate everything except the data tables. And so now if I change that 10 back to a 5, it shouldn't change my blue dots until I hit F9 and rerun the entire simulation. It's a little bit irritating when it reruns the entire simulation and we're not ready to. So I'm going to come back here and hit 10%. And notice it doesn't move the blue dots. So here again, you're graded on creativity on your dashboard, and I would think you would want to tie the dashboard to the goals so that the client could change the goal, could change the value at risk. And then when we report a chance of success, we don't really want to report 75. So in this case, our piece of S is going to be 1 minus that. So we really have a 25% confidence that we will meet or exceed this goal of 70,000. So that's the number I would report on the dashboard as the probability of success. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video interesting.